Nerdarchy for nerds by nerds, and today I'm hanging out with Will Donaldson. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. And you're coming to me from the other side of the pond over in the UK. And
hmm
today we were getting together to talk about Dead in the West, which is a Western RPG that Will has come up with.
That's right. I like to say it is a game set in the mythologized Old West, by which I mean, rather than being a game set in a historical setting, it is more like a game set in an old cowboy movie or a pulpy 50s novel. And the game can support more historical-based games. In fact, there are rules specifically for if you want to play during like the Sioux War here in the Dakota Territory or something like that. But the main theme of the game is to feel like, the kinds of larger than life characters that would populate old folk tales or old cowboy movies.
Now, I find it interesting that you decided to do a game on this because you're significantly younger than myself,
Mm-hmm.
and I almost feel like this is a genre that's kind of dying out a little bit.
Well, westerns are an interesting genre, and uh, by the way, I went to film school, so I'm a complete wanker about these things. But the interesting thing about westerns is the westerns everyone remembers are kind of like the samurai movies that everyone remembers, insofar as every really good western movie is about how the West is dying and it doesn't exist anymore. And every good samurai movie is about how the samurai culture is poisonous and inherently defunct. And it's weird that the Western movies and the samurai movies everyone remembers and holds up are kind of their own greatest critiques. And that relates to the genre dying because lately we've had this influx of, I don't know a better way to put it, but sort of post-Western influences, like things like Jane Got a Gun, True Grit, Deadwood, The Assassination of Jesse James, 310 to Yuma. Around like 2005, 2006, there was an influx of like Western movies that were nihilistic and almost about destroying this mythic old Western setting. They were sort of like at their heart against those that sort of idealized American frontier. And I like the new stuff, but I also really like the old stuff because the new westerns tend to have this problem of being inherently opposed to the ideology of those old westerns, while also just stealing their iconography. And it's sort of this weird, if you get what I mean.
We want to be a Western, but we don't. Yeah,
Yes, it's we want to deconstruct the Western while also unironically doing everything a Western does. And I kind of maybe call me cheesy, but I like the American folklore. I like the idea of having larger than life, fun, legendary characters, and I like old cowboy movies. And I think westerns. I don't know if they'll ever come back, but there are still good westerns every now and then.
yeah, and hey, there's first of all, there's nothing wrong with liking what you like. I think
Mm.
everyone should do such unapologetically. As long as it's not hurting someone else or taking away from somebody else, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So, so you're a fan of the Western, which has led you to a tabletop role playing game. What kind of
hmm
experiences did you have in tabletop role playing games before, uh, writing some of your own?
Well, I played 3.5 for a while, and while I love 3.5, and a part of me still really does love 3.5. Um, it was sort of like a lot of my own design philosophies came around issues I had with 3.5. And the more games I played, I played Unknown Armies, which is, I think, a dead game now. I play a lot of Dungeon Crawl Classics. I like 5th edition a lot. It has some problems, but overall, I really like 5th edition. And I really love Burning Wheel. And my experience was sort of playing these kind of games and thinking about them as storytelling tools, and sort of thinking about, you know, the thing I think that players remember most about role-playing games and about their experiences are people really like building strong characters, and they like min-maxing, and they like, you know, all that stuff. But what people remember are the sort of crazy last-ditch things where you do something that has a 1 in 100 chance of working, and it does, or you know, you look at your spell list and you realize that you can use one of your magic spells in a really weird way that maybe the game doesn't account for. And I think those like eureka moments are really the heart and soul of tabletop gaming. The kind of things that make everyone around the table laugh and clap, or like everyone sort of nod and smile. And Dead in the West, I kind of wanted to build a game specifically around supporting moments like that, specifically around innovation and creativity, and letting players like all just sort of laugh at how stupid something someone did was, or how brilliant something someone did was, or both at the same time.
You know, those moments you talk about, and it is kind of like how I've modeled the way I GM, and has influenced heavily like how our games go, and why I think it's really important to be a yes GM instead of a no GM.
Yes,
because
exactly.
you can't have all those cool moments without being open to letting players do stupid things sometimes. And it's not so much about letting them do succeed at it, but it's about letting them try.
Yes, exactly. Like the kind of moments I'm thinking about are if you're playing 5th edition and you're running away from some guards, you can say, "Can I use summon food to just summon a bunch of banana peels behind me, or bananas, or whatever?" You know, those kinds of like weird things. Or, you know, if I summon a floating disc and the rest of the party stand on it, can I then turn into a bird and fly away and have it carry the disc behind me? You know, those are the kind of things that I think 5th edition in particular is really good at. And there's something in 5th edition where I can't remember where it says it in the manual, but they say something like 5th edition is a game of rulings rather than rules. And I really, really like that. And that's sort of one of the key components of Dead in the West is anything you do, you can try. It doesn't mean you'll succeed. And you are rewarded for doing risky, innovative, and creative things. And the more of those you do, the easier doing more becomes. And I think that really ties into the idea of being a, you know, legendary character like Jesse James or Calamity Jane or something like that.
So, DM Don has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, oh, no, it says not a question, but I think right on time. If you right on time, if you pay attention to geek culture as a whole, westerns are then the next hot thing. I would strap on a 6-gun every once in a while, and it's also one of those things. Maybe it's not my go-to, but it's definitely something like you for a change of pace. I would absolutely get into. So, do you want to? Speaking of getting into, do you want to start delving into Dead in the West, and you know what exactly you did to make it feel the way you want it to feel, and what does character creation look like, and that kind of stuff?
Okay. Well, a lot of Dead in the West came around the idea of encouraging more risks and risky maneuvers and encouraging roleplay a bit more. And I was thinking a lot about the intelligence and charisma stats that crop up in loads and loads of RPGs. And I was thinking about how having just a single charisma stat can lead to instances of roleplay where you know, there's a diplomatic situation everyone wants to resolve, but only one person's playing a bard, and that person just sort of, instead of role playing, says, "I convinced them," and rolls a dice, and how that sort of like stops role playing dead in its tracks a little bit. And if you want to play that way, that's perfectly fine, obviously. But I was sort of thinking about how you would go about countering that, and in Dead in the West, characters don't have an intelligence stat, they don't have a charisma stat, they don't have a strength stat. Rather, all of these things are split into multiple branches. So, for instance, rather than having a charisma stat, there are 3 schools of speech, which is at the time called sly talk, but I hope I think of a better name than that. So you have a stat that determines your ability to threaten and lead people. You have a stat that determines your ability to beg and barter, and you have a stat that determines your ability to suck up and compliment. And any character can be good at one or all of those things. And similarly for combat, you have a stat that determines how good you are with improvised weapons and bare knuckle brawling. You have a stat that determines how good you are with pistols and knives, and you have a stat that determines how good you are with rifles and longbows. And when you are creating your character, you could be good at any of those things or none of those things, and your character is still viable. And I really wanted to do that. I really wanted to create a situation where if you approached a diplomatic situation, everyone has a different way of communicating, and everyone has a different way of approaching that situation. And all of them are viable, and they all lead to different outcomes. I think I may have gotten away from your question a little bit. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So is the character creation, since that's where we're kind of talking, is it a class-based system? Is it a skill-based system?
No. Instead, there are a number of decisions you make when you create your character. Absolutely no classes. One of the key components of Dead in the West is that when you eventually level up, or when you reach a certain point in character progression, you earn abilities. And abilities are not determined by class. They are not something that you just sort of spec into. Abilities are specifically earned by what you actually do in gameplay sessions. And examples I like to use are, if you are a character that likes using whips a lot, and you are also a pacifist, when you level up, you may get the ability to, for instance, snap weapons out of opponents' hands. If you, for instance, are a character who enjoys cooking a lot, but is very bad at it, you may earn the ability to make a soup that gives roll a D100 to see what it does. So you don't progress down a class tree, you don't select things from a list. You are given abilities based on what you actually do in between leveling up. And in Dead in the West, it will include a big list of suggested abilities and how you might unlock them. It will also include a step-by-step guide for a GM for creating your own. And really what I want to encourage is the idea that every party feels very different. Because as players level up, they'll do different things, they'll be granted different abilities. And by the time they reach 3rd level, you have characters that play in completely different ways, who have completely different skills and do completely different things. And that sort of goes in with the idea of creating characters that are really like legendary individuals who have very specific and unique skills that are different from everyone else in the party. Now, there are other things as well. You have stats that determine, your toughness, your reflexes and everything. But most of the things that make your character unique come from those abilities and what you do to earn them and how you end up using them.
Now, what kind of games can you play with this system? Is it all going to be like you're either going to be playing kind of historical, or you're going to be playing maybe modeled after Western movies, as far, whether you're talking Tombstone or Blazing Saddles, depending on which way you want to go, or or could you even do something like Deadlands?
I have played a horror game using this system, and it worked incredibly well. It was a horror set in the Old West, obviously, but I found the systems worked like they work shockingly well in creating a. It was actually one of the games I played was a slow burn cosmic horror that was slowly sort of revealed over the course of multiple sessions, and it worked terrifically. So I have played historical based settings. I have played, the sort of classic cowboy things where your players are doing train heists and everything. I have done murder mysteries where everyone was invited to a fancy debutante's ball and someone was killed and the doors were locked. And I have done a horror setting, and the system has worked with all of those. The system works perfectly fine for games where you have no combat whatsoever, and it works very well for strategic combat. So I hope that doesn't sound like too, arseholey, I'm promoting my game, but I have honestly been really, really surprised by just how many ideas I had that the system worked with. The only thing I think it didn't really gel so well on is I had a game that was like very, very on rails. And it was sort of like the players were in a gambling riverboat, and it was sort of a campaign where I wanted to basically just have it be a game of political intrigue with a bunch of like mini games for like gambling put in there. That's the only one where it didn't really work out. But everything else I had tried, I was very, very happy with how the system handled it, and players seemed to have a blast. They really, really loved the like slow cowboy horror game. That worked very well. And the murder mystery was a lot of fun. When the players realized what kind of campaign it was, they all like immediately became overjoyed and sort of like laughed at the realization of what this was going to be.
Now the riverboat game you talked about, that sounds like that doesn't sound that hard to do in any particular system. If that didn't work out, that sounds more like the players were sort of into it.
I want to say it was more my own fault as a GM. It was more like my idea was they were going to be on this riverboat. There were like 20 named NPCs. They all knew bits and pieces of information, and there were these like mini games. There were like these mini games that they could play as well to like earn money during it. That was like I looked up a bunch of old cowboy card games and things, but it was more the fact that that was a campaign where there was no forward momentum outside of the player's actions. And sometimes that works great. Sometimes players know exactly what they want to do, and they do it, and it leads the campaign in interesting directions. In this situation, they were on a boat, so they couldn't go anywhere, and all they could really do was talk to people. So I wonder if it was the system or more like I was just being very short-sighted as a GM. Speaking of, now that I think about the horror campaign, one of my greatest lessons as a GM was that your players are smart. They are not stupid movie characters. So in the horror campaign, I had built up this one cursed, not cursed, but this one town that was like a ghost town, and it was spooky, and characters have been talking about it for like 5 sessions leading up to them going there. And when they went there, I played this like spooky music, and they arrived, and there was like this thick cloud of dust hanging in the air, and there was this bloody sun in the sky, and it was like this really creepy, tense thing. And I was like, okay, in my GM's notes, I was like, they're going to split up to investigate, and they're going to go here, 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 here. And the first thing they did when they arrived is they were like, well, first things first, we're definitely not splitting up, are we? And they were like, no, of course not. And I was like, yeah, why would they? And that was a like really good moment for me as a GM, because I was like, yeah, why would they ever do that?
Never split the party.
Yeah, don't split the party, but like even more than that, don't split the party. And the one thing everyone always yells at characters in horror movies is like, don't split up. So I had all of these like ambushy things and spooky things planned, and I had to be like, yeah, why would they ever do that? But that was just another example of players surprising me in Dead in the West.
Yeah, it happens to the best of us. So, what is the resolution mechanic for Dead in the West?
So, I'm working on a quick guide right now, just for when it's funded. Just a quick thing that everyone will get within the first few days of the Kickstarter being funded. That's the very basics of how to play, and it opens with your fate is in the D8. Almost everything in the game is handled with 1d8 plus or minus a modifier dependent on situation. That modifier can be based on a specific talent you have, on a stat, or on situational elements. Everything outside of combat typically comes down to the GM decides a difficulty roll, and then the players roll 1d8 to determine the outcome. Interestingly, in Dead in the West, I designed this push-pull mechanic to that, though, because it's not just 1d8. If you roll a 1 on any check, a 1 is a critical failure. And a critical failure is, in the rulebook, described as the situation drastically changes in a way the players didn't expect. That always happens when you roll a 1. And that's situational. But it always changes, and always in a way that does not benefit the players. And the way you counter that is through points of vigor. And vigor are points that a GM awards players whenever they do something innovative, creative, or unexpected. And what a point of vigor does is it nullifies a critical failure, or it adds 2 to a roll. So it sort of leads to this really fun, I found, push-pull mechanic where a critical failure is always looming overhead for players, which encourages them to do dangerous, innovative, and risky things, so they don't have to, they won't suffer the full consequences. So it's the resolution mechanic is 1d8 plus or minus modifiers, with the players constantly thinking about the points of vigor they have, how they can earn more, and weighing up what could happen if I get a crit fail right now. And combat is a lot more complex, but most things outside of combat, besides a few specific systems like horseback riding and everything, are handled with 1d8.
So, on a D8, if the 1 is a crit fail, that's going to come up fairly often.
Yes.
In comparison to rolling percentile, or even a
Yes.
D20 where it's a 5%.
Mm.
So is it, and the D8 is for the combat mechanic as well?
D8 is used in combat, but other dice are used in combat as well. In Dead in the West, something about games that had sort of bothered me, and this is very pedantic, but no one really, or a lot of games handle guns in a very strange way, I find. A lot of games will treat guns as being strength or dexterity based, and that doesn't really make sense to me. So in Dead in the West, when you in Dead in the West, what you roll for first off is accuracy, and then you roll a dice to determine your damage. So your result on the accuracy roll determines a multiplier that will affect your damage roll. So you roll a d8, which determines how accurate you are, and then you roll, a d6 for pistols, a d8 for rifles, a d4 for an improvised weapon, etc., etc. But what you're rolling for, mostly, the more important of those two rolls is actually your accuracy. And there are lots of other things in combat, like there are systems for having the high ground. There's a system for corralling enemies. There is a system in which you can become a sitting duck, which is quite fun. There is a system for toppling and grappling and restraining enemies. There are systems for creating your own cover. One of the systems that my players have had the most fun with is there's a very fun system for finding improvised weapons within 5 feet of you, which is like an intelligence roll where you like basically roll to determine what you can very quickly figure out will hurt someone, and then reaching for it and hitting them with it. But in combat, accuracy is a D8. Most of the important things in Den of the West are 1d8.
How that kind of like segues into KB's question, answers it partially, which he is, how did you come up with your damage die for firearms? Which you kind of talked about a little bit, but what it kind of prompts me to ask is, what I want to know is, how lethal is the system?
People will die very quickly if you are communicating with your team. Communication in Den of the West is very important, I found. It's actually in combat. When I first created it, I realized how much more of a strategic combat system it is than I first realized, because if you, for instance, in the game, positioning is very important. Where your characters are and where they can get to are hugely important to survivability. If you are not communicating very well, then firearms are dangerous. But if you are communicating well, and if the enemies are communicating well, it can be very, very lethal very quickly, which adds to this idea of, if you are in a tense situation where you think combat will break out, it becomes even more tense, because you know, if these guys you're going up against are, coordinated and communicate well, they can be very dangerous and start taking people out very quickly. Now when your HP goes down to 0 in Dead in the West, you are not immediately dead. There's no coming back from the dead once you are, but when your HP reaches 0, you enter what is called bleeding out. And when you are bleeding out, it means you have a limited pool of HP, and everything your character does will tick your HP down by 1. And when you're out of bleed out points, you're dead. But when you are bleeding out, every point of vigor you spend also is worth +3 rather than +2. So when you're bleeding out, you sort of enter this Hail Mary last stand thing, where when you're near death, the adrenaline starts kicking, and you are more likely to succeed at whatever crazy last-ditch thing you're trying to do. But going back to the question, firearms are dangerous, but if you are communicating, they are even more dangerous.
So we have some good questions rolling in now. I'm just going to kind of take them as they come in the order.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm not reading them myself. I got eyesight for an old man.
No worries. So, DM Dom, does the system come with a pre-made story adventure? How fleshed out is the world, or do we build our own?
The world of Dead in the West is explicitly malleable. It is a world for the creation of the GM. However, in the rulebook, there are several pages explaining different periods in American history and why they might make good settings and how that might affect your game world. It says, create whatever world you want, but here are some very good building blocks for creating your own world. So, for instance, a favorite of mine is the Dakota Territory during the Sioux Wars. If you're doing a historical setting, that is a very, very interesting and, in my opinion, a quite dark setting for a campaign. But there is also a guide for, if you want to, for instance, set your game nowhere in particular, just, for lack of better terms, the Wild West. So the game world is very malleable. It's sort of down to GMs. However, there are pages talking about interesting periods in history, why you might set them there, and how that might change certain rules in the game.
So Christopher House actually has As a question that I actually was thinking of when we're talking about character creation and the
Mhm.
different types of games, is how about mystical aspects of the era, or what they would call spiritualism? Can
Yes.
if I want to play a Native American that maybe uses
Mm.
is a shaman, could I do that?
Um, okay, so trying very hard not to put my foot in my mouth here. Um, Dead in the West absolutely encourages you to play any kind of person you want to play. In terms of magic in the game, uh, I don't actually want to spoil too much, but um, every character has a stat called Hoodoo. And when you're creating your character, you roll 1d10, not a d8. So players, I find, already are like, a d10. You roll 1d10, you do not write down your result. You remember it and you tell your GM. And as a player, you never get to know what Hoodoo does.
Hmm.
It's a mystery for the entirety of the game. If you ever tell anyone what your Hoodoo score is, you have to immediately re-roll it. No one can know any other player's Hoodoo score, and you are not allowed as a player to know what it does. Now, obviously, when the game comes out, anyone can look this up and sort of find out what it involves and everything. But it sort of says in the rule book, hey, if you're a player, part of the fun is not knowing this. And if you're a GM, it explains what Hoodoo is and what it does. So without getting too far into it, there are rules in Dead in the West for if you want to play a game with more spiritualism, more animism, or more magic, or whatever. There are rules to accompany that, but they are not fundamental and necessary rules. They are optional rules for if you want that in your campaign.
So, how much have you used those in your campaigns?
Uh, in the horror game, I used it quite a lot, and it was a lot of fun, honestly. Um, and as a GM secret here, don't tell anyone this, but as a GM, if just every now and then you say, hey, Mark, roll a d10, suddenly everyone at the table is like, what's he doing? And when he rolls it, you say, okay, what did you roll? And then they say the number and you go, okay, interesting. And you write something down. Everyone will pay attention from that point on because they remember, was that a Hoodoo roll? What's going on here? So I have used Hoodoo a lot. As a GM, you can maybe use it to kind of just get people's attention. You shouldn't do that too much. Hoodoo is best used as sparingly and in exciting ways. I used it during the horror campaign. It came up quite a bit, but I also almost every game session I've run, I found ways to use it. It's a lot of fun to use. It's something that, in my opinion, unless you're doing specifically a very supernatural game, shouldn't be overused. But I've had plenty of chances, even in not very supernatural games, to use Hoodoo.
So, in the rule set, does it cover like, oh, I want to play a really supernatural heavy game, and this is how to use that stat?
Yes, but that is only for GMs. So, and this comes down to my sensibility actually, because I think in Dead in the West, if you're playing a very supernatural game, because of the setting, because of the Great American Frontier, because of the like superstitions and folkloric beliefs at the time, magic and spiritualism and animism, I think in that setting in particular, is this mysterious, unknown, and overwhelming thing, and I think it becomes more powerful when there's this big element of mystery about it to the players, which is why it's sort of handled in the way it is. And if you want to go really heavy into that, it suggests ways to do that and things players can know. But I think it works at its best when it's this almost cosmic thing. Like, I like cosmic horror a lot. I like slow burns. The horror campaign I did started off as a completely normal campaign, and over about 10 sessions, the players started to realize something very strange was going on, something was up, and something was weird. And as the Hoodoo dice came out more and more, they were wondering, what's going on? What is this being used for? and it was a really like fun experience that led to some very like scary moments. My biggest problem with Call of Cthulhu is it's called Call of Cthulhu, and everyone is expecting that sort of stuff. So, do you get what I mean?
No, I do. Like, my issue with Call of Cthulhu is, like you said, it's in the name, and then a lot of people want to play that game like it's a D&D game, and someone, oh, I'm a crazy veteran, so they can use weapons and stuff. But, like, if you're an actual fan of the lore, you know
exactly.
nothing you do actually really matters.
Yes, and like with Call of Cthulhu, I think cosmic horror works best when you don't know what's coming. When it's like this overwhelming thing that makes you feel small and is like this big presence that you can't quite comprehend, but you know you can't overpower it. That's like when cosmic horror is at its best. And Call of Cthulhu does lots of really good stuff, but if you go into a campaign knowing that's coming, it takes away one of the best parts of that genre, I think.
I think.
And sorry.
I was just going to say, I think with a game like that, though, you kind of have to know your players. So you're not, like, thrusting them into a game that they have no interest in playing.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you are kind of, like, you kind of are, like, hitting them over the head with that one. If they're like, oh, we're playing a Western game, and then all of a sudden it's Eldritch Horror.
Exactly. Which is why it's definitely up to GM's discretion whether or not to do that. The base set of rules says, here's how to use Hoodoo and occasions to use it, but it does so in a way that is A, completely optional, you never have to use it, B, the default suggestions for how you use it don't necessarily mean the world is magic, if that makes sense. But then there are advanced suggestions of, here are other ways to use it if you do want a more cosmic horror or more magic-based game.
So, and guys and gals in the chat, if you have a question, just remember to throw a question in front of it. It makes it a lot easier to pick them out. Tea time with Toby. Are there rules for trick shots, like shooting a gun out of hand or a dynamite or something? If there are, how difficult is it?
One of the most fun systems in the game is a mechanic called Quick Draw. And what that means is at any... when players are suspicious of a character, they can declare Quick Draw and force that character into like an Old West style shootout where you both reach for your guns and they do a roll to determine who wins it. And Quick Draw is super fun. Most of the time in Dead in the West, the way combat will begin is the GM will say, X reaches for the weapon, roll initiative. And if a player yells Quick Draw between the GM saying X reaches for their weapon and roll initiative in that pause there, then they successfully Quick Draw. And it's a fun mechanic that keeps players on their toes, especially if they think combat is about to break out, because it means they can essentially sometimes end combat before it even begins. But there are mechanics for trick shots, like shooting weapons out of people's hands, and there are mechanics for doing sort of elaborate things like that, like in for a few dollars more when Lee Van Cleef is just shooting Clint Eastwood's hat over and over again in the air so it never hits the ground. There are mechanics for things like that. But Quick Draw is the mechanic like that comes to mind and is really, really fun. Players have responded very, very positively to Quick Draw. And it keeps them, I found, it keeps players constantly paying attention. And another thing that's fun about Quick Draw is just because you do it doesn't mean you'll succeed at it, and it doesn't mean you are justified in doing it. I have had players Quick Draw against people who are reaching for boxes of matches, who were just putting their hand in a drawer to get some papers or something because they were paranoid. And those situations are very fun to roleplay.
Oops.
If you can imagine a character reaching for something, a player quick drawing against them, missing, and then it turning out the character was actually just reaching for some papers or something, that is an incredibly awkward situation and very fun to roleplay.
I feel like it'd be even more awkward if you shoot them dead and they're reaching for their matches or whatever.
So, sorry.
Uh,
I just very quickly, a quick draw encounter that has lived in infamy is the first ever game we played. One of my good friends, Mark, they went to this town. The town was kind of crazy. There was some bad stuff going on. It became more and more evident that weird stuff was going on in the town. And at the end, there was this little boy who was like seen as a evangelist. Kind of, the town was convinced this kid could speak to God, basically. And at the end of the campaign, when everything had basically gone to shit, and the party were like, "We need to get out of here right now."
I know. Did we lose you? And it looks like Will is completely frozen at the moment. That was rather sudden out of the blue, and I had more questions to ask. Darn it. So we'll give it a couple minutes, folks. See if Will comes back and unfreezes. Who knows what the internet is doing over on the other side of the world right now. But I wanted to hear the story, darn it. And he's gone, and he's back. There we go. like, darn it! I wanted to hear the story, and he's frozen.
Where did it stop? Where did I get?
Your friend Mark, first game.
Yes. Oh, okay. So in the first game, they went to this town where everything was like everything was very strange. Everything was kind of spooky. Something was obviously going on, and there was this kid that the town was basically convinced could talk to God. And so this kid was like this evangelical. He was raised since he was, 5 years old to be like, you are essentially a messianic figure. And at the end of the campaign, everything had kind of gone to shit. The party had not really achieved their goals, and they were like, okay, we need to leave. We need to just get out of here as soon as possible. Am I still with you?
Yep, you're still good.
Okay. And at the end of the campaign, as they were all like rushing out of town, they ran into this kid. And I was like, okay, this kid reaches into their waistcoat pocket, and Mark went, quick draw. I was like, everyone in the party was like, you're quick drawing against this 10-year-old boy? And Mark quick drew against him. He only like grazed him, but it was enough to like make the kid fall over. And everyone else in the party were like, okay, we all turn on Mark's character. He just tried to kill a kid. And Mark was like, oh, okay. And that led to the funny instance of him realizing everyone had turned against him. He tried to steal a horse, even though I was like, Mark, you have no horse riding ability whatsoever. He got, and he was like, I know, I'm just going to go for it. He got on it, immediately fell off the horse, got kicked in the head, and landed face down in the mud. As everyone sort of gathered around and were like, should we just let Mark's character die?
In the mud.
And that was a fun example of when quick draw went very badly for a character.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask, I guess, is how widely have you played the game as far as, different people, or is it, has it been the same people kind of play testing the game over and over again? And also, how rules heavy is it? Because you keep talking about a lot of mechanics and systems.
Well, to answer the second question first, in terms of how rules heavy it is very much a game of, like 5th edition, rulings rather than rules. I think the rule of cool is something that's floated a lot, and Vigor really plays into that, of like, let people attempt things, and as a GM, come up with an appropriate way for them to do it. In combat, it's more rules heavy, only because that sort of makes combat more interesting, I found. But that idea still applies in combat of let players try innovative, interesting, and risky things. That's sort of a very, very core concept of the game. And sorry, what was your first question?
How widely have you play tested the game?
I have GM'd around 30 games with 20 different people, maybe a little more than 20, I'd say like 22 different people, including friends and just strangers on Roll20 who agreed to do it with me. I have been a player in, I think, 4 games, and a number of people have played it without me being there at all. I was very kind of nervous that as a creator, if I were there, even if I weren't playing, I'd be like, oh, actually, you need to do this. So I asked people to play it without any input from me whatsoever. In fact, people in the chat, there is a channel called Tabletop Talk on YouTube. I think they have about 3,000 subscribers. They played a game of Dead in the West, but unfortunately, they were going to record it and upload it, but that didn't come to fruition in the end, sadly. But they played a quite long game and got back to me about it. And even though the game of Dead in the West isn't up, you should check them out because they're very fun, talented people. So I have GM'd a lot of games. I have been a player in not as many, and I have taken notes from a lot of people that have played the game as well.
No, I mean that's definitely a decent sampling for sure. And the real test, is the one that makes you the most nervous, and that is what happens if they just play the game, without any supervision, and how easy is it for them to learn and pick up. Obviously, the Mighty Hob, would it not be better for the GM to secretly make the Hoodoo roll so the players are entirely in the dark regarding it?
You can do it either way. You can. It's sort of context sensitive whether the player or the GM makes the Hoodoo roll. Hoodoo tends to involve a specific person, a specific party member, a bare knuckle brawler / improvised weapon user. There are options for being a knife wielding character. There are options for strange weapons as well. I haven't really gotten into this, but one of the other ways you progress your character in Dead in the West is every level up, you have a number of points you can spend on what I call experiences. And these experiences are things like dancing, knot tying, tracking, etc., etc. They are either skills or fields of knowledge. So like military knowledge is a experience as well. And when you level up, you have a number of points to put into those. Some experiences, however, are for using strange weapons. And strange weapons are things like grappling hooks, whips, what's a good example? Pepper box guns. If you've ever seen a pepper box gun, it's a pistol that fires 12 bullets at once for swords. But these are all things that you don't necessarily start with. These are things that you aspire to and build up to being good at in the future. And strange weapons all behave, as the name suggests, strangely. So, for instance, a hand cannon is a pistol that is very large and imposing looking, and it's actually more difficult to fire with. But when you have it in your hand, you gain a bonus to any attempt you make to threaten someone because it's so scary looking. And strange weapons include lots of things, like swords, like grappling hooks, like whips, like brass knuckles, like barbed wire. So if you don't want to be a gunslinger, right from level 0, if you don't want to be a gunslinger, you have the option to be a bare knuckle fighter, to use improvised weapons, to use a longbow, to use knives, to use a rifle. But as you level up, you can branch out into increasingly more weird and strange and specific things. And strange weapons also tie in very well to abilities. So as an example, I had a player who had a pepper box gun, and she, as a player, had the worst luck. She rolled crit fail after crit fail after crit fail. And so I gave her this ability, which is if she's wielding the pepperbox gun and she rolls a crit fail, every single bullet immediately fires into whatever enemy she's looking at. And she doesn't need to make an accuracy roll. It's just like she pulls it up, rolls a crit one, and that was a lot of fun. It got to the point where when she would use her pepper box, she would be like, "Come on, one! Come on, one!" Yes. Sorry, to get back to that question, you absolutely do not have to be a gunslinger. You can use a wide variety of weird weapons, or be a kickboxer, or be a bow wielder.
What about, Mighty Hobbs wants to know, what about ninjas in the Wild West, a la Warrior's Way?
Ninjas in the Wild West. I ran a game where they did come into contact with a samurai, and that game was really awesome. It was a game where essentially they were fighting one NPC. They were traveling along a mountain, and the entire campaign session was them going across this precarious sort of mountain area. And there was one NPC that was a samurai that really didn't want them to cross over and travel the mountain. And because, like I said, guns are dangerous, especially if you all coordinate. I made this NPC very smart, and I gave them very unique and fun abilities that made it so even though he had as much HP as everyone else, he was on the same sort of playing field because of the abilities he had. Even when he was outnumbered 6-1, he was putting our players through a lot of trouble. So like it opened with he exploded a bunch of dynamite, not to actually hurt anyone, but to throw a bunch of dust up in the air. And one of his abilities was if his vision was obscured by like dust or something, he wouldn't suffer an accuracy modifier as long as he was within 5 feet of an opponent. So all this dust went up in the air, and suddenly everyone was like, "Where is he? Where is he? Where is he?" And they had this like almost predator and prey scenario where he was like running through the dust with his like samurai sword out, getting up close to people, with them being like, "Oh god, he's here, he's here, he's here," and then him suddenly like cutting people down. And so ninjas in the Wild West, probably the rules would probably allow for something like that.
So it's doable for sure. So Condor DM wanted to know if there are any sessions up posted. There almost was a session that was posted. But I don't. That was the only one, right?
Yeah, sadly, if you go onto the Kickstarter, which the link is in the video description, in the video I have advertising the Kickstarter. There are clips from a play session, but in all fairness, it's like less than a minute altogether. And I'm trying to sell my game, so I pick clips of people having fun, obviously. So sadly, those are the only clips I have of people playing. I almost had the people over at Tabletop Talk upload a session, but that didn't come to fruition, which I was very bummed about because it sounded like they had a great time. From what they said, they had lots of instances of someone saying "quick draw" and another player going, "You idiot! Why would you do that?" Which sounds great to me. That's sort of the kind of experience that I think is really fun in this game.
Tea Time with Toby wants to know if you're looking for playtesters.
If you want to playtest, shoot me a message on Kickstarter.
Yeah.
I will say, if you donate, if you back just £6, which I think is $9, if you just back that, you get sent a quick guide, which is about 30-page long explanation of the rules, so you can get playing like quickly. The Kickstarter is in its final 48 hours. It's made, I think, 68% of its goal, which is kind of the exact amount of money it needed to make for me to be very anxious right now. Because most Kickstarters I have read make around 30% of their budget in the last day. So the fact I'm on 68% makes me very, very nervous of being like,
you're on the cusp, going by that metric. Yes,
I'm on the absolute cusp. I mean, some people have been. I have been trying to answer every single question I'm asked, whether it be in the FAQ or personally via private messages. I'm very, very open to talking to people about the game. I post updates quite a lot. And people have responded really, really positively. Something that has made me very happy is whenever I release an update explaining how mechanics work in the game, I see this odd thing of people have, every time I've done that, people have increased their pledge amounts, which makes me like very confident, because it means like I put this stuff out there, people see it, and they think it sounds cool and they're willing to pledge more. And that's been a really, really great experience. Along with just people on Kickstarter have been so supportive and so nice, and they've been like talking about telling their friends and everything. And the tabletop role-playing community online, I have found, has been like everywhere I've gone, whether it be story games or RPG Net or RPG Pub, all these places are very supportive and very friendly. So if people want to play test it, I've play tested it a lot, but if you don't really want to contribute a lot of money and you just want to get the basics to play, I think it's, again, I don't know the conversion rate, so I'm sorry, but it's, I think, less than $10 to get a 30-page quick guide for the rules. It's £6, so
whatever that is.
Whatever that is.
In your whatever £6 is in your Monopoly money.
Yeah.
That's fair enough. So the one lazy guy, and I think I kind of got the gist of this question just from our discussion is, are there options for playing people from different societies, normal Old West, China, Japan, or even tribal cultures? And that doesn't seem like something that actually factors into the character creation. That would be more like your flavor text and decisions you make.
Yes, it comes into character creation when you determine what your starting ability would be. In the first game I played, my friend Scott, rather than playing a cowboy, was a Russian Cossack. And he explicitly was like, Will, I don't want my character to speak fluent English. And I was like, cool. So the way I handled that was he had an English experience which he could choose to level up. And every time he would talk, I would actually say, Scott, you're trying to communicate something too complicated. And he would go, okay. And he would have to come up with like sign language and how his character would express it that way. But yes, you can absolutely play as characters in other cultures. The system is probably like, I haven't tried it actually, but I think with a few adjustments, you could probably use the same system to do, for instance, a English Civil War setting, or a like there was a Australian Badlands setting with like Ned Kelly was a famous like Australian outlaw. You could probably set it there too. So yeah, character, history, and background factors in, to answer the question, as much as you want it to. So if you want to play a Russian Cossack, when I was giving Scott abilities, his background as being a Russian Cossack played into that, and it changed the sort of things he could do as he leveled up.
So we are right up on the hour. So, what do you want to leave people with before we head on out?
I want to leave people with, Dead in the West is a game I find where situations are constantly changing. I have never played a game where it feels like something is stagnating, or people the situation isn't advancing in some quick or fun or exciting new way. It's a game that really encourages innovation, creativity, risky and sometimes stupid behavior. It's a game I've had a blast making, a huge amount of fun GMing and playing, and I would love to share it with as many people as possible. So if you think what you've heard sounds fun or sounds cool, please give the Kickstarter a look. and tell your friends.
Well, awesome. I want to thank you for hanging out with us today, Will. And thank everyone
Thank
for
you.
hanging out in the chat and asking questions. Go check out the Kickstarter. Links are
And
in the description on Facebook and YouTube. If you're on Twitch and you happen to be seeing this, you have to head over to one of these other places. Or you could just Google Dead in the West Kickstarter and it should come right up. But with that, until next time, guys, stay nerdy.
happy trails. Bye.